how do we apply risk assessment to mitigation planning, implementation, and monitoring for effectiveness? So Ryan, do you want to talk a little bit about what risk assessment is?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I think probably most attendees here today, if not all, are pretty well versed. I think a lot of the points that we like to make when we go into both high level and some pretty detailed discussions about what is a risk assessment is it tends to be primarily a qualitative. Obviously, there's some semi-quantitative elements that can be applied, but a risk assessment, as the name implies, is an assessment process of risks. I think one of the things that's interesting, and even in our industry, we tend to think about risks as things, when in reality, we know as risk assessment professionals, it really describes probabilities of likelihood. So a risk assessment process simply helps us to identify the probabilities we're usually interested in preventing potential negative consequences. And I think, the goal of going through a risk assessment process is sort of the upstream process for us to identify what those probabilities of negative consequences are so that we have the ability to reduce those either through mitigation or elimination. So when do you do a risk assessment? This is a question that a lot of times can be different for each institution or enterprise. There's the periodic, perspective. Some institutions like to execute a risk assessment on sort of an annual basis, biannual basis, depends on the nature of your operations, or there's event-based. And when we think about event-based, what we're really thinking about is, has the research program changed? Has something changed in the program that now those ripple effects could impact other aspects of operations or safety or security? We need to assess those as they occur. So periodic and event-based typically are the 2 points of timing.
So I'll add to Ryan's earlier point that risk assessment is a process. It is something that is ongoing and repeated. So you never really finish the process. And we like to talk about having a process, and that seems like an obvious thing when you're talking about risk assessment. But I think one of the most challenging things is to avoid using a checklist and just saying, okay, we're good. We have eliminated the risk, or we have acknowledged the risk. So pick a process. There are a lot of different ways that you can go about it. And we're going to talk briefly about the process that we use for risk assessment. There are lots of ways that this can be done, but pick something and stick with it. And do that for a couple of reasons. You want to make sure that you are you're covering the same ground every time. You are measuring apples against apples. You're trying to understand any changes over time, and you want to avoid just picking and choosing things that are either of the moment or are intimidating, because that's when you end up missing out on things that really could cause a problem in the future. And then I think also it's important to acknowledge your own bias. So what are your strengths as a professional, or whoever is doing the risk assessment process? Is this something that you are internally judging yourself on risk? Is this something that you've got an objective third party or a less objective third party? So understand what might be creating biases in your risk. Is it something that you know that this has caused a problem in the past, and so you're really going to focus in on one area of potential risk or threat? So the first place that I like to start with risk assessment or threat assessment, and I will say risk and threat assessment almost interchangeably throughout this, and that seems a bit odd, but it is a process that allows us to identify both risks to individuals, risks to the public, as well as risks to the asset itself or threats to the asset itself. And what do I mean when I say an asset? An asset is your biological material of value. So I'll refer to that from now on probably as valuable biological material. What is that? It might be, and I think what most people think of when we're talking about laboratory biosafety and biosecurity, we think about pathogens and toxins that you would find in a lab. But I will note that it does not have to be material that is dangerous. It could be anything of value. It could be something that has intellectual property value. And for that reason, we also talk about the associated data. This is an area that is certainly becoming more and more one of focus, as we digitize a lot more information and there's increased access to that information. So understanding that when we're talking about valuable biological material, we're really assessing what could be either the source of risk to humans who work with it, or it could be the potential recipient of threat or hazard that might cause damage to it. So I'm going to talk about risk assessment in terms of a framework. And I think we talk a lot about risk and threat management. We talk about risk assessment. We talk about biorisk management. It's all part of a larger framework and process. But when we're going through this, we want to take the same steps each time. And I think I mentioned earlier that there are lots of different methods for conducting a risk or threat assessment. These are generally part of all of them. So in your first step, you're gathering information. You're trying to understand both the asset or valuable biological material, the environment, and the people who are working with those materials. So what is the valuable biological material? Where did it come from? How will I use it? What hazards are associated with it? Then we're going to evaluate the risks. And I think a lot of risk assessment professionals are pretty familiar with this chart that I've put up here. But basically, for every potential outcome, what is the likelihood of that happening? So what's the frequency of that happening? And this is really, it is going to depend on your institution as what you categorize as frequent or improbable. So for certain folks, that might be frequent is 5 times a year. It might also, for a different institution, be that frequent is 5 times an hour. So what is the potential for that happening? How often? And then what's the potential severity if it does happen? And we rate those from catastrophic to essentially negligible or not impactful. And so everybody asks, how do I know what the severity of something is? What does that really mean? What is a catastrophic risk? And again, as long as you're consistent in your institutional assessment and you're measuring things in the same way, it can be up to the institution. What I like to say is negligible is something that really isn't going to cause a problem. Is it something that shouldn't happen? Potentially, but if there's not a problem that results from it, it ends up being a negligible risk. Marginal is going to have a minor threat or minor bad outcome, mostly at the institutional level. Something that is critical, I generally think of as having a high potential negative outcome at the institution, or potentially a more minor outcome outside of the institution. And then something that is catastrophic, I typically think of as having a severe negative consequence to those both inside and outside of the institution. And as you go through this, you'll find that everyone has a bit of a different opinion on these things. And that's why it's important that when you're doing a risk assessment, it's happening consistently across the institution or organization. So then we're going to develop a risk control strategy. So you can do a few different things with potential sources of risk. You can mitigate that risk, and that's what we talk about a lot. So we've said that we potentially have an exposure hazard for airway exposure. So, okay, well, let's look at airway protection. So that's mitigating a risk. We can accept a risk. What does that mean? That means we say, okay, well, that's a risk. We acknowledge the risk. There's really nothing we can do about it, but we have determined at an institutional or organizational level that this is a process that just has to continue. And so we acknowledge that, and we acknowledge the potential for negative consequences associated with it. That's one that really people do not like at all. And then there's removal of that risk. So if we've got a potentially dangerous agent, could we substitute something in so that we don't have to have that particular pathogen that's exposing people to a potentially negative outcome? So that allows us to remove that potential for risk. All right, then we're going to go ahead and select and implement those risk control measures. And I'm sure a lot of folks have seen this hierarchy of controls. And obviously elimination is the thing that's going to be the most effective, right? So that'll definitely give you the largest impact. If you can eliminate the potential source of risk, you're going to eliminate the possibility of that risk happening. You're going to take that frequency down to zero. Then we might substitute it. We might institute engineering controls. So that is, a lot of folks think about facility-based solutions, anything that is going to be associated with the way that you handle the material within the built environment. And then administrative controls, which I think this is what most people think of when they think of biosafety precautions, but it's also one of the hardest to successfully integrate over and over again. And because it requires people to be doing the right thing all the time. And then we're going to review those risks and the risk control measures. And this is what Ryan talked about a couple of minutes ago in terms of it's not a process that ends. It's something that you're going to review on either a periodic basis or more frequently on an event-based basis. So this is one chart that we use, and this is one of the things that I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. It's really important that you record things. And that seems really obvious, but there's a couple of reasons for this. One is it helps you to rack and stack, to prioritize what you're going to do, because you've got all of those things cataloged and you know what the potential impacts are. Another reason is if somebody else picks this up, you want them to understand what your thought process was, what was happening when you did the assessment. Another reason is you want to know where you're going from year to year or from event to event to make sure that, all right, did we do what we said we should do? And if we didn't, why not? And if we did, but it didn't work, then what happened? So we talk about this, and I mentioned earlier that we use a different framework in terms of threat versus risk versus vulnerability. Ryan, do you want to walk us through what that might look like in terms of some of those definitions in the process there?
Yeah, I think so. You know, we've got you'll see a very high level. We call it the threat vulnerability risk equation here in a moment. But we've already discussed that, you know, risks truly are probabilities. When we talk about a threat, you know, a threat is something that has the ability to impart a potential negative consequence by way of a vulnerability. And what do I mean by that? A threat can be something that has directionality, that is moving, you know, towards your program, your facility, your valuable biological materials, what have you. You know, in a strict law enforcement definition of threat, that typically means a person. You know, for the past 15 years, we've at least in the bio risk management world, we've elaborated that to include non-human hazards as well. Those tend to be things, right? People, a weather event, what have you. A vulnerability is really, you know, the point of penetration into your program. This is the point that a threat can interface with that may have the ability to result in a negative consequence. So I think we have to look at, you know, all three of those components to understand the entire, I would say, process stream of how these things happen. One of the things that I think we like to point out here on this particular slide is you'll notice in the 3 rows, we have exactly the same threat. But you will see that that threat has the ability to interface with different vulnerabilities. So it's not a one-to-one-to-one. And I think that's an important concept for us to grasp when we do this, is that a single threat can impact multiple vulnerabilities and result in multiple consequences. So hopefully that helps, and let's keep going.
So Ryan just talked about that process, and I talked earlier about that frequency and severity estimation that we do to give us that ultimate risk class. What I would say is one of the more common things for folks to do is to rank or to assess the current situation. The important part about this is to assess the unmitigated risk first. This is incredibly important and will come into play later. So we've taken a look at these things and we say, okay, well, maybe the frequency of this is 5, meaning that it happens incredibly frequently. or the potential for this to occur happens incredibly frequently. So a negligent employee is always going to have access to the facility. That's all day, every day kind of thing. In terms of a severity, that is taking a look at if this is to result in a negative outcome, how severe is the negative outcome? So try not to compile those two into the same ranking, but we'll do those separately. What's the frequency of it potentially happening? And if it does happen, what's that potential severity? So then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to identify those actions that we can use to reduce risk to the lowest tolerable level. So I think there's a couple of important points about this, and this is where we always talk about mitigation strategies. And this is really where biosafety professionals tend to shine, is that risk reduction, those mitigation steps. So we're reducing them. We're not usually eliminating them. Now, I know I talked about elimination as a possibility, but that's often not going to be the choice that we make, because you're doing this work for a reason. You're potentially exposing yourself to risk for a reason at an organizational or individual level. There's value in the work that's being done. So we're just going to reduce that risk as low as we can and to the lowest tolerable level. That's another word that I think we get hung up on sometimes, is nothing is tolerable. And so I think this is an organizational discussion to have. Risk tolerance is something that an organization needs to understand. So talked earlier about understanding bias in assessment. So how do we avoid that? I think these are some good components to that. Don't do it by yourself. One person should not be the only person ever doing anything to do with risk and threat assessment. We always want to use that consistent approach that I talked about before, but we really don't want to use a checklist. And I think this is probably one of the more common errors that folks will make, is using a checklist. Because if it's not on the checklist, then you're not thinking about it. And you're not thinking about the process if you're just thinking about, okay, did we do this today? So want to make sure that we're using a process and not a checklist. And then again, write it down so that people understood what you were thinking and so that you can articulate it. So what are some of the potential errors that we have in implementation? So Ryan, do you want to talk a little bit about the standard approach of what people do?
Sure. Yeah. So I think to go back to where Lauren wrapped up there a minute ago, is that checklist approach. I would say, when you borrow from a checklist, which is nothing wrong with having a checklist as a guide point, right, or some form of template. But I think what we have to keep in mind is that every assessment we do is usually, an amalgamation of unique events and unique environments and settings. So when you use a checklist, it's almost undermining the expertise and the experience that the various stakeholders conducting the assessment bring to the table. We really want to focus on that. That being said, this is a good one, right? The assumption is that we've got this covered. I think when we talk about risk and threat assessment, we oftentimes, may assume that some of the standard mitigation strategies and tactics are in place, and therefore we have some blanket coverage, and that alone reduces, the probability of a negative consequence to a tolerable level. That may not be true. I think the reality is that many times we go into these assessment processes and we don't know what we don't know. That's a big piece of this.
So I know that we are talking about risk, but ignoring the threat landscape is a really common error in doing this risk and threat assessment. Ignoring what's happening around. So make sure that you understand what your potential risks, hazards, and threats are. And this image is of a tornado, right? So do you live in an area of the country that has really high likelihood of severe weather events? What are the potential negative outcomes associated with that? And what might you be able to do to reduce the vulnerability of your facility? I think this also could be, what about your people? What about your population, internal and external to your organization? What does that look like? Is everyone trained? What does your facility look like? Does your facility have inherent issues or vulnerabilities? So understand what that threat landscape looks like. This is one that I think we miss out on a lot. And this is why we break it out the way we do in that chart that we talked through earlier. You've got to link the threat to the risk. So the potential negative outcome has to be linked to what caused it. So make sure that you don't skip over the vulnerability piece. So if you've got no vulnerability in your facility, if you've got a facility that can't allow a threat to penetrate, you're going to have a lot less potential for risk. So make sure that you don't skip over that component part. This one's one I alluded to earlier. Don't base your decisions off the already mitigated risks. So we've already got a mitigation in place. There's no risk. This is like saying, well, I'm already wearing gloves, so it's fine. Make sure that you understand that, and that your leadership understands that when you're thinking through your risk management program, you need to base it off of unmitigated risk. This also will allow you to prioritize the mitigations that you put in place, making sure that you're not spending time or money in places that it's not that useful.
Yeah, here's another one. Someone already has it covered. We talk about silos in risk assessment programs a lot. And a classic example is that maybe the biosafety program is that major component that often conducts risk assessments. When we do that, we may be overlooking other aspects of threat and vulnerability and risk by way of animal care and research programs, or environmental health and safety, or cybersecurity. So what we don't want is somebody that is in the animal care program to assume that the biosafety program has it covered. That may not be true. That also, when you make that assumption, that false assumption, you're potentially not accepting the fact that there are other types of threats and vulnerabilities that may not be exclusive to my particular silo or program, but can actually have an impact.
I think this is one of the most common ones in those event-based assessments is we've got to get it done quickly. We're just going to zip through, whether that is because we've got an inspection coming or whether that is because we've got an emergency that's perceived. We've got to do it quickly. We're going to just slap some duct tape on it, make sure we've covered ourselves for this risk. That is a reactive posture rather than kind of a forward-thinking approach. And so we want to make sure that even if you are reacting to an incident, you go back and you think it through pretty carefully. All right, so mechanisms. How does this get implemented? It really does look different for everyone. And for that reason, we want to make sure that we integrate those stakeholders, both within the organization and outside of the organization, so that we understand everybody's different perspectives and everybody's pain points. What does everyone have as that issue that plagues them, that keeps them up at night? This will also allow us to set expectations for all of the people who may be interacting with the biorisk management program. And it allows us to understand whether we are going to be able to meet those expectations.
So when you think about getting senior leadership on board, why is that important? Well, it's not just because they hold the purse strings often, right? And they will have access to potentially the resources that will allow you to mitigate the risks that you've identified. What I think this speaks to, more importantly than just that particular example, is you need good buy-in from top down. I think this is something we talk about, but that buy-in usually comes from having really strong communication platforms that allows every aspect of an organization or enterprise to understand what the assessment is, what it's intended to do, and then of course the mitigation tactics that are going to be required to do that. So there's nothing wrong with asking for support. In fact, we usually find that to be a very welcome question, right? And then tracking progress. I think that's another big aspect of this is, how do you know, and this is something that again is different for every enterprise, how do you know that you've made progress? It's not just a matter of filling out the chart that we have. So it's very important that you understand and built in what your metrics are for understanding that progress has been made.
Going on that theme of communication, it's not just leadership that we need to communicate with, we also have to communicate to staff. And everybody has something that they have as their day job. And we want to make sure we don't interrupt their day job. And we want to make sure that we are expressing our needs at a very clear, easy level. So make it easy, make it clear, and avoid any kind of punitive measures or punishment. A biorisk management program does not typically function well if there is the threat of potential punishment for something going wrong, because sometimes things aren't people's fault. So this will create that culture of safety, that culture of security. And we want to make sure that we are preventing bad things from happening. We're not kind of after the fact in terms of we're now reacting to something that has been earlier a risk and is now a realized event. So kind of key takeaways here, make sure you have a process and you use that process. Focus on the purpose of what you're doing. Understand why you're doing the assessment and why you're managing risk. And communicate the so what. So what is important about what you're doing and what is important about what you are asking either leadership or staff to do, so that they understand the potential for impact of all of their actions and behaviors. So thanks very much for having us today. We really appreciate your time. Happy to answer more questions either now or if you think of them later. So I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Ryan and Lauren. I'll open it up to the floor to see if anyone has any questions. You can just raise your hand using the raise hand function, and I will call upon you to ask your question. And I do see one. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Ryan.
This is Lauren. I was going to say we do see one in the chat. So Michael asks, how do we place engineering control in the hierarchy of control in disadvantaged environments, i.e. constant availability of power, expertise, and maintenance technicians? This is certainly close to home for us. Ryan, do you want to go ahead and start with that?
Yeah, this is a big topic, right? And this is something alone we could give dedicate a lot of time to discussion. But I think in general, this is one of the advantages that a risk assessment process brings to the table. What do I mean by that? I mean that a risk assessment is going to be geographic, enterprise, specific, right? And you heard us talk about the fact, don't take a checklist approach. Don't borrow a risk assessment from a university in Missouri and think that risk assessment, is going to be good for, a public health laboratory in Central Africa. You have to take those things into consideration. I think that the other thing that you have to do is you have to think about how do you prioritize what those things are. And finally, I think the other piece is that there's usually not just one approach to one particular risk, right? The sustainability, the engineering controls, those are pretty big. In most cases, not every case, but in most cases, what we find is that engineering controls are not the priority. Engineering controls tend to not be the priority as a primary or even a sole risk mitigation approach. Rather, it's going to come down to the specifics of the expertise of the personnel. Let me give a couple of quick anecdotes about that. We were working, when you think about where are particular diseases endemic, okay? So if you're in an area where, say, tuberculosis is endemic, do you need all the engineering controls necessary for, say, a BSL-3 laboratory when you may be working with tuberculosis in that space? You've got tuberculosis on either side of that wall. That's the importance of taking a risk-based approach. I was working on a public health laboratory in the Caribbean years ago, and I encountered some of probably the best clinical microbiologists I'd ever worked with. And their laboratory facilities were, scant on engineering controls. It was really the technique and their appreciation of the safety, the identification of the risks That is what kept that laboratory safe. It wasn't necessarily dedicated exhaust or supply or directional airflow. That being said, there are a lot of creative things that you can do. And we'd be happy to talk about what some of those creative, cost-effective, sustainable solutions are to help you achieve certain criteria that we tend to think of as those engineering controls. But just don't overlook the importance of doing a site-specific risk assessment and understand the environment around you. Hope that helps.
Thank you, Ryan. And I see a hand raised from Michael.
All right. Thank you, Gabby, and thank you, Lauren and Brian. I'm Michael Agbaje from Nigeria. I was at the last last APSA conference in the US, and this issue came up in one of our pre-conference courses. It was very exhaustive in our deliberations, particularly where you think that some localities, just like just mentioned a few minutes ago in the Caribbean, where you find yourself in a very low budget kind of lab, and you still have to try and juggle around to ensure that safety is preserved. And on that basis, we agreed that even the idea of hierarchy of control in itself, I think it's something that has to be looked at. Because if I use a PPE and I adhere to all the principles I need to use, because I do not have access to a strong administrative control or engineering control, then that becomes my best control. And then in the hierarchy, it would then not be right for me to begin to talk about administrative eliminations, substitutions, before what I think within my locality is the best, affordable, and available. That is just my contribution. Thank you very much.
I think that's a really great point. And I think we think of the hierarchy of controls as what we, quote, should do. I think really what that hierarchy of controls tells us is it's almost inverse to the amount of expertise and training and thinking that the people have to do. So if you've got something that has an engineering solution, your staff have to think a lot less, and they have to be a lot less well-trained and a lot less cautious because the facility is protecting you. So understanding, while I fully agree with you, that is not always the hierarchy of what should happen. I think what should happen is what is feasible and appropriate in the environment. So thanks very much for that.
You're welcome.
Okay. Thank you to our speakers. In the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and move to the next agenda item. But Lauren and Ryan, there is one additional question in the chat. So if you could just respond to them in the chat, that would be awesome. So thank you so much to our speakers. Our next agenda item will be to discuss just ongoing activity under APP3. So I will be giving a brief overview of how the GLOW event went. Then we'll be discussing the upcoming ministerial meeting that will be happening in the Republic of Korea and the side event that APP3 will be hosting, discussing any expressions of interest for the 2023 APP3 chair/co-chairship. And then I'm just talking and encouraging people to submit impact stories as well. So I will quickly review what happened during the GLOW event. So during the GLOW event that we hosted last month, we had a really excellent turnout. So thank you so much to everyone who was involved and who showed up to that. Participants learned about the critical role that biosafety and biosecurity plays in health security, and they were given an overview of APP3, including its history, the purpose, goals, and a deep dive on the 2022 work plan, detailing the actions that we're taking to strengthen biosafety and biosecurity capacities globally. We had representatives from the action package on accountability and results, and they gave an update on progress made to the 2024 GHSA targets with a focus on biosafety and biosecurity indicators. We then had a panel of 3 different APP3 stakeholders representing government, as well as the private sector and regional international organizations. So it's like I thank Gail Trotman from Barbados, Sam Dietrich from American Company, and Jennifer Lastly from WOA for being on that panel. They gave presentations on how they are working to improve biosafety and biosecurity capacities through the training, through trainings that they provide to their various participants. And finally, we had a discussion on the future of biosafety and biosecurity challenges. And as excuse me, as we approach 2024 and the end of this current GHSA cycle, how we can look towards the future of biosafety, biosecurity, and how GHSA can help tackle these future issues. I will resend out the video recording for this, so those who are unable to attend can still view it, and I'll also send out the meeting report as well. So now I will turn to discuss the upcoming GHSA ministerial meeting and the ministerial side event that we have applied for. So we are actively planning for a biosafety and biosecurity side event at this meeting. Our initial proposal for the side event was accepted by the meeting organizers, and we're working to ensure that there's adequate space and time, and we hope to accomplish our meeting objectives. So to that end, here's an overview of the agenda that we've developed with the co-chairs. So the APP3 co-chairs will provide welcome and review of the progress we have done thus far this year, highlighting the efforts that everyone has contributed to. And following that, we'll have a panel discussion highlighting the current state of biosafety and biosecurity, outlining impacts and effects from COVID-19. Participants will discuss how COVID-19 affected the global landscape and consider the impact of the proliferation of new high containment laboratories around the world. And we hope to have a diverse representation on the panel with participants drawn from the private sector, national government, civil society, and multilateral organizations. Next, we will have a moderated discussion on the critical need to strengthen biosecurity norms and adapt to rapid technological advances. This session will look to future challenges posed by rapid biotech advances and how global structures such as the Global Health Security Agenda can be utilized to prepare for a safer and more secure future. And finally, we hope to draft and release a short statement on biosafety and biosecurity support to the future of GHSA, and this document will provide a foundation for activities. And during that time frame, we'll hope to communicate to GHSA leadership once finalized. So if you have any ideas for this statement, or if you would like to be part of this meeting agenda and will be on the ground in Korea, please email the APP3 coordinating team and APP3 co-chairs at our Gmail account, which will pop into the chat. And we will circulate a draft statement in early November for comment ahead of the ministerial. And unfortunately, we will not have available a virtual option. The conference organizers have let us know that this is not feasible for them at the time to provide this capability at the conference venue. And we would like to get a good understanding of who will be physically there at the meeting. So either you or a representative from your office or your government. We would want to get an idea of possible speakers for the event and who would want to engage. So once again, just please let us know if you are planning to be in attendance. And now I'd like to switch it over to our co-chair, Peter, to see if he has any additional updates for us at the time for the ministerial. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you so much, Gabby. Can you hear me very well?
Yes, I can hear you, Peter.
Okay, yeah. I guess because that's the same time, around the same time we're supposed to have our monthly meeting, and I wanted to kind of get an appreciation for the appetite for members to have our monthly meeting in person in Korea, depending on how many are definitely planning to come. In addition to that, our side event, we've been assigned a very generous hall. I think it sits about 200. So I really hope all of us can show up in a huge way and also convince our counterparts in other governments or in other organizations to come along and attend our side events as you're networking, as you're making plans for the meeting, just to call them along. We hope to have a rich participation and to also bring on board some new members. Over to you, Gabby.
Thank you, Peter. So the only other thing that I wanted to mention is that as we start to wrap up this year, we need to just start looking towards chairs for next year for 2023. So obviously this year we had the co-chairship between Uganda and Africa CDC. So we just want to start putting out the statement for expression of interest. So if anyone is interested in having in being the co-chair or the chair for APP3 in 2023, please reach out to the current co-chairs and we can work on setting up any meetings to just discuss potential transition or potential activities for next year. We'll be giving more details in email in our meeting and in our meeting minutes, but just wanted to formally put that out to the to all those who attended today, and we'll send out additional information to the listserv as well. So Peter, do you have anything to say about 2023 chairship?
Yeah, thanks again, Gabi. So colleagues, as you know, Uganda hasn't been the eternal chair of AP3. We also generously picked up the baton from CARFA. So we, Uganda and Africa CDC, would really want all members who are interested, and I emphasize interested. I'm not specifically saying you're committed 100%, but even if you just want to have a one-on-one with us and hear out what it's like and what is involved and what the commitments are, you're welcome to express your interest. And then as we wrap up those bilaterals, we can now kind of narrow down on who will take over the chairmanship. I like the risk assessment slide. They taught us that do not assume someone else is doing it. If you truly have an interest, put in a bid, because you may assume someone else has done it and you'll find actually you're the only one who has picked the interest. So let's not assume, try to put in a bid. We are also hoping that we can do the handover during the ministerial in Korea, and of course there'll also be the steering group meeting. So it will be a good chance to introduce the new chairs or co-chairs to the rest of the steering group members and the action package coordination and everyone else. So kindly reach out to the action package secretariat or to the chairs, or whichever ways you wish to reach out to us, just get in touch and then we can have the follow-up discussions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter. Okay, and then now we'll just move over into our final agenda item, which is just any other business. So would anybody like to take the floor and give any programmatic updates or any information on any upcoming meetings within the biosafety and biosecurity space? You can just raise your hand and I will call upon you. Okay, Michael. Michael, do you have any updates? To see that your hand is raised, or is that a raised hand from earlier during the Q&A session? Okay, well, Michael, I don't see you coming off mute. So if you do have an update, please feel free just to email us that update and I can make sure that we include it in the meeting minutes. And that statement can be applied to anyone. If you have any updates that you just don't want to give during the call right now, we can go ahead and send that out to the listserv via our meeting minutes. With that, I would like to thank our speakers, Dr. Ryan Burnett and Dr. Lauren Richardson, for giving your risk assessment on biosafety and biosecurity. It was very helpful, and I will make sure to gather the slides for you so we can make sure that we send it out to the entire group. And I just want to remind everyone once again that if you're interested in being part of the ministerial side event meeting or just attending the ministerial in general, please let us know. And if you have any interest in being part of the 2023 APP3 chairmanship, to please let the current chairs know as well. So I will go ahead and adjourn this meeting, and we will hopefully see you in Korea. Thank you.